Can I first start by saying that in good news overnight, we have only had one new case in hotel quarantine. That is fantastic news, Queensland, and Queensland, you've done us all proud. It's absolutely fantastic news to think that we have no community transmission in Queensland, and that's through the hard work of every single Queenslander, and I can't be more proud than what our state has done. We have 6 active cases. Our total is 1,172, and in the total 24 hours we've had 4,191 tests. So once again, the testing rate is really good. We're satisfied with that, and once again, it's if you're sick, stay at home and get tested. Well, of course, today I have had a briefing from Dr. Young. So you'll hear from myself first, and then the Deputy Premier, and then you'll hear separately from Dr. Young and the Deputy Commissioner, and you'll be able to ask them questions, and then we'll come back and answer any further questions. So today, I just want to advise Queenslanders the following on the advice of Dr. Young. Queensland will be, Victoria will be closed to Queensland. So that's step one, that remains closed, and that is a strong border decision that we have taken every step of the way. I think everyone will remember when Deb Frecklington called for all the borders to be open and the consequences that could have happened there. And the other initiative, the other area we're announcing today is that in relation to New South Wales, Greater Sydney will remain closed to Queensland, and that is 32 local government areas. Now, Dr. Young has provided advice to me in relation to community transmission, and as I said, Queensland will hear directly from Dr. Young about that. And in relation to the 1st of November opening date, we have been advised by the Deputy Commissioner, and he will talk to that will move to the 3rd of November from 1 a.m. That is to ensure that all the border passes that need to be renewed will be able to be renewed effectively and efficiently. So once again, a big thank you to Queensland for the great work that you have been doing, and I'll hand over to the Deputy Premier to make some comments. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you so much, Premier. That is wonderful news that we again have no cases of community transmission. That gentleman in his 50s had travelled to Stockholm, travelled back from Stockholm and was in hotel quarantine. We continue to urge people in the Ipswich area to get tested. The Chief Health Officer will outline in a moment some wastewater results from Wynnum that are also concerning, and she will urge people in that area to go and get tested. Our Premier and this government, our Premier is one who does what she says she will do. She said she would listen to the health advice. She said we would review the border arrangements at the end of the month, and that is exactly what has happened here. We monitored very, very closely the community transmission in New South Wales and Victoria, and based on the Chief Health Officer's advice, the Queensland border will remain closed to people who travel through Victoria and through the 32 local government areas of Greater Sydney. That was precisely the health advice. That's what we have done today, what we've been determined to do throughout this pandemic. The adjustment of the arrangements will come into effect at 1 a.m. on the 3rd. The Deputy Commissioner will speak to those arrangements. This is a substantial change to our border arrangements, and so it will take that time to ensure that they can be implemented smoothly. But I think what you can see here is a very, very stark contrast. Our Premier, who listens to the advice and acts on the advice, versus Deb Frecklington, who said she wouldn't borrow and announced yesterday she would borrow. She said she would cut, and she announced yesterday. She said she wouldn't cut, and she announced yesterday she would cut. She said she would have big, bold, visionary plans, but instead there are no big, bold, visionary plans. And she said she would listen to the health advice, but we now know that she will only listen to Gladys and others in the LNP. So that's the choice here, a Premier who listens to the advice and does what she says, or one who says one thing and does another.
Minister, we'll just now hand over to Dr. Young and the Deputy Commissioner, and then we'll come back. So we'll go over here.
Well, good morning. So good news again for Queensland. One new case overnight, a gentleman in his 50s who returned from Stockholm and was in hotel quarantine in the Gold Coast and will now be admitted to the Gold Coast University Hospital. It proves that our quarantine process is keeping Queensland safe. Then we also saw that positive sewage result in Carroll Park. I'm waiting on a retest for that sewage. Then we've just recently been told of a positive sewage test result in Wynnum. So it's really important that Queenslanders continue to come forward and get tested if they have any symptoms. That is critically important. There is a concern that we might have virus circulating. The best way to deal with that is to come forward and get tested. So anyone who lives out in that Ipswich area or who lives in Wynnum, it's really important in particular that you come forward and get tested. There are fever clinics available, and we turn around most of those tests within 24 hours. So it's quick and simple, but absolutely critical. Now, I have reviewed the situation in New South Wales. Prior to yesterday, they had 4 local government areas in Sydney that had had cases of community transmission that New South Wales was unable to link to any known clusters, which means that they have transmission and they don't know where it's coming from. Then yesterday they had 4 new cases, and one of those cases they could not link to any other known clusters. The other 3 cases were linked to that case. So that meant then another area of Sydney was having cases. New South Wales put out an alert for 6 different sites across the city where they were concerned that transmission could have occurred. So based on that new information yesterday and the information up to that point, I believe it's important that Queensland remain closed to those 32 LGAs in Sydney. So as I said, there were 4 LGAs, then there was this new case which has involved additional LGAs, and we know that Sydney, of course, is one city and people move around that city. So that's why those 32 LGAs all need to be declared as hotspots. Now, outside those 32 LGAs, there have not been any cases in the previous 28 days. So that is really good news, and New South Wales has done really exceptionally well. I mean, they had a hard start because of those cases that came into New South Wales from Melbourne, and it's taken them a while to get on top of those original cases. And we can see that their biggest risk is still that southwestern part of Sydney. That's where they're continuing to have those cases, and then every so often they'll have cases elsewhere in Sydney because people from that area have gone there, seeded an outbreak. Then New South Wales has got on top of it because they do have very good systems, but they're still struggling to get on top of those cases in the southwestern part. So the decision is that Queensland will remain closed to New South Wales, to those 32 LGAs, but as of 1 a.m. on the 3rd of November, the rest of New South Wales is open and people will be able to travel up into Queensland for any reason at all. And Queenslanders will be able to travel down into New South Wales to those areas for any reason at all. And they can travel via Sydney Airport at Mascot, but they will need to then travel through Sydney without stopping in Sydney to get to those areas outside those 32 LGAs in Sydney.
Jeanette, how do you arrive at the decision to stop people from outside Sydney coming into Brisbane when in effect you can travel in and out of Sydney for work? It seems an arbitrary border. How did you come up with that?
Because that's where the vast majority of the movement's happening, and we have not seen, despite those cases in southwestern Sydney, we have not seen seeding outside. So we haven't seen seeding in those areas of the Hawkesbury, of Wollongong, of the Blue Mountains. It's been within Sydney. So their big risk. Yes, they have, and they've gone and done enormous testing. So New South Wales, and it's a very important point you've raised, New South Wales has a very, very good testing program. They're doing large numbers of tests of their population, plus they are doing extensive sewerage testing as well. So that's why it's so reassuring to know that they've not had cases found outside Sydney. So it's all about numbers. There's 4.8 million people who live in those 32 LGAs in Sydney. They're the risk. They're the ones that are moving around. Yes, there are smaller numbers outside who will travel into Sydney. If they travel into Sydney, they then can't come to Queensland for 14 days, so that will be protected. And we will see if they travel into Sydney, go out of Sydney, and then cause infections there, they'll be rapidly picked up.
Are you confirming then that as long as there is any cases whatsoever in any of these LGAs, the Greater Sydney will remain closed until there is a vaccine?
That's true, unlinked cases. So we've had a small number of unlinked cases, but whenever you have an unlinked case, particularly in a place that is so well managed as the health service in New South Wales, they will have done their absolute best to find the linkage. If they can't find the linkage, that means they've got cases there that they don't know about that are spreading in that community. So it's all about unlinked cases.
One case in an LGA within that Greater Sydney area at any point will rule out all 32?
No, as I tried to explain, my concern was there were 4 LGAs and then we had these 4 cases and they'd been to multiple LGAs. So then it becomes impossible to manage it. So it's really got to be a sensible geographical area because people don't live in LGAs. They cross out of those LGAs to other places. So that's why you need to have a sensible geographical area.
Will we see a hard border closure again, or will you just be declaring LGAs as hotspots from now?
You're asking me to look into a crystal ball. I genuinely don't know. It depends what happens with this virus. We're learning more and more and more about it every single day, and what we are learning is that it's actually very contagious. So we just have to look at the evidence, and I look at the evidence every single day, 7 days a week, and work out what is the best advice for me to provide to keep Queenslanders safe.
Threshold of when an LGA will be declared a hotspot? Is it one case of unlinked community transmission and they'll be added to that list of 32?
That's at the moment, yes, that is what we would do. At the moment, with the information and the knowledge we have, one unlinked case means that there is a problem in that community.
Off the list is it 28 days of no unlinked cases and then you're off that 32?
It depends. There's so many other factors. I've been, unfortunately, very simplistic that it's one case of within 28 days, but there are a whole lot of other things that I look at. So I've already described some of them. It's the amount of testing. For instance, there are some countries in the world that have not had many cases, but we know that's because they're not testing. Whereas in New South Wales, I do know they're testing, and they're testing very, very large numbers, and they're testing the sewage. So it's about making sure that testing's occurring so that you know that you can rely on the information that's coming out.
Prime Minister's plan to reopen all states except for Western Australia by Christmas in June. Are you saying if these parameters aren't met, then you're quite happy to keep that borders closed if you make Sydney closed during Christmas?
I will always give advice to make sure that Queenslanders are kept as safe as they can possibly be kept safe.
There's a possibility then that we will remain closed.
Anything could happen, but also there's a strong possibility that we'll be open because New South Wales is getting on top of these cases. If we look where New South Wales was not that long ago with the number of cases and we look at where they are now, they are genuinely getting on top of those cases. The next issue will be Victoria. So Victoria is doing a really good job getting on top of their cases, but we now have to see what happens when they open up. because they were getting on top of those cases while everyone was at home, except for those 4 reasons that they could leave home. So we'll now have to watch what happens when they open up. But hopefully they've now got all of their systems in place. They're doing a lot of testing. They've got a lot more contact tracing ability. So the next stage will be to look at how they progress and when we can open to them.
Advice about pursuing an elimination strategy or a suppression strategy. What are we pursuing?
We are pursuing a suppression strategy. We always have been. We are allowing people to come into our state who are potentially carrying the virus. That's why we have quarantine. So our borders do get crossed from international places, and now the world's at over 43 million cases, 1.2 million deaths. So we know that we will see more cases in hotel quarantine. That's a risk. We have not had a breach here in Queensland from our hotels due to the absolutely magnificent work of our police service in this state. We have seen breaches in Melbourne, we've seen them in Sydney, and we've seen them in Auckland. So we know that's a risk. So it's always been a suppression strategy. It's never been an elimination strategy.
Are you worried that our contact tracers won't be able to cope with an outbreak if we open to Sydney?
No, they showed how well they coped. We had those 3 young women return from Melbourne, and we ended up with an outbreak at the end of 55 people, which was an amazing result, and that was due to those contact tracers. They were contacting thousands and thousands of people and organising quarantine.
Who live in Sydney, can they visit people who aren't in a hotspot and then
Of course they can. It's not for us to say what people can do in New South Wales. That is up to New South Wales. So of course people in Sydney today, under the New South Wales arrangements, can travel anywhere in their state. They haven't put in place internal borders, unlike Victoria.
It makes sense then, Dr. Young, they can travel anywhere.
Yep.
And you've been managed to point out for a number of weeks now that many people are asymptomatic, they don't show the virus.
Yep.
How can then you make a decision to say that if you're from a region you can come when you know full well people from Sydney are going there? From outside of Queensland, it doesn't make sense.
No, it makes perfect sense, as I explained before.
But the
So,
transmission can still happen.
yes, of course it can, but that's why I said testing is critical. So we know New South Wales is testing. So they're testing large numbers of people and they're testing sewage, the same as we are, and that will give them a heads up. So they had that positive test in the sewage after the Bathurst 1000 race, which was probably due to someone visiting from Sydney. They then went and tested people, they didn't find any cases. So people who live in Sydney, depending what the arrangements are for New South Wales of course, can go anywhere outside of Sydney. Once they've been there for 14 days, they can then come to Queensland.
So if there's one case in a region, does that shut down that whole area?
There's potentially that, yes, but we haven't had a case.
No, so if there's one case, that is the rule. Is that a hard and fast? Because businesses out there are trying to plan for the future.
Yeah.
If you're saying that it might be the case or it might not, it starts to look like it. With respect, there's an element of politics being played here during an election. Is there a definitive answer? If there's a case, then you shut that off.
If it's an unlinked case, so New South Wales does not know where it came from, then yes, that would trigger a discussion about closing that local government area.
It's not a hard and fast yes or no.
There's nothing hard or fast, unfortunately, about this pandemic. We're 10 months in and we are still learning about this virus. There are so many variables here that we have to work through time and time again. That's really important.
Do you still apply the 48-hour rule to finding a link to a case?
Yes, that was the decision that was reached by AHPPC.
And so these new cases that have popped up in southwestern Sydney in the last few days, does that mean that it resets the 28-day counter clock for us?
Yes, that's what's happened here. So that's why we are not opening to Greater Sydney today.
And if Sydney residents go and spend 14 days outside of Sydney, what proof does Queensland require for them to cross the border?
I might ask the Deputy Commissioner to answer that question as they manage that process.
Before we move on, Dr. Young, given where we're at with the virus in Queensland, why can't you increase the density in licensed venues given that we're at zero? Presumably, there are other infectious diseases circulating in the community. We could move those
because we know that indoors is extremely high risk.
Outdoors though, outdoors.
We've increased it, so it's 1 per 2 square metres outdoors. That's been in place for a while.
Why can't you return it to, I guess, a normal level of density, that being that people decide their own density for an area?
Because we're going to have to learn to live with this virus, and it's really important that we do put in place some processes to protect ourselves. As I've said earlier, we had that positive in Carroll Park in the sewage. We've had a positive in Wynnum that we got told of yesterday. So we know that there is potentially virus out there. We are going for a suppression strategy, as I said earlier, not an elimination strategy. So New Zealand went for an elimination strategy, and that's why they opened everything up. Then they've had more cases, most recently related to their port, and we ended up with the ship that was responsible for those cases, then travelled from New Zealand to Queensland, and it's currently sitting off the coast of Queensland. So going for an elimination strategy is probably impossible, I think, in the world as we are today. We would need to go for that to be able to return totally to normal.
Off the back of that question before, are you worried people are going to lie to try and cross the border?
Could I ask the police to answer that question? But let's be honest here, the vast majority of people have told us the truth. The vast majority of people, when we go and speak to them to do contact tracing, have told us the truth. The vast majority tell us the truth when they come across the border. There are always going to be some people who lie, and that's what the police force are very good at being able to detect.
The next review of this the end of the month in November.
Yes.
So that continues the end of the month arrangement to review.
Yes.
New South Wales has their own app. They won't open their borders to Victoria until they have the app. Is Queensland going to get an app and will we impose those sort of restrictions on?
And which app? We've got so many apps.
I think they have the government has their own app. Will we be developing one?
So we do have different apps that we've been using. So there's the QR code that's been, I think that's the one you're referring to for New South Wales.
Will we be required?
We're already using apps here.
It won't be mandatory.
No, every business is able to utilise that app if it works for them. Otherwise, they can use different processes. Whatever works for a business. We're not here to tell businesses how to run themselves.
Dr. Young, what's the health advice if we don't get a vaccine by early next year? Does it continue as it is?
Yes, it does. We've been very, very successful. You look at where we are today in Queensland compared to so many parts of the world. I mean, looking at the Northern Hemisphere as they go into winter must be terrifying for them. They're seeing overwhelmed hospitals again. They're seeing massive numbers of cases. They're seeing the need to go back into hard lockdowns. So this has worked for us. So until there's either a vaccine or an effective treatment, I mean, if we have an effective treatment, that will also change what we need to do. We are going to have to maintain these restrictions.
Who says the country's going to open up for Christmas?
Um,
Because the Prime Minister said the country's going to open up. He's
Yeah.
effectively saying that if there's one case in Sydney, well, then that's not good enough.
No.
Sydney's
So I went and checked what he meant by opening up. I checked that with the acting chief medical officer, and he meant removing the borders wherever that was possible, but he didn't mean about removing all of the restrictions that are in place.
So not really opening up.
Well, it depends what his definition of opening up was, which is why.
You're giving the advice to the Premier.
Yep.
It's okay.
My
Obviously
def-
following the health advice at the
Yep.
moment. What's your definition?
I believe we have to maintain those restrictions that we've got in place. So those density restrictions, those crowd number restrictions, all of those we do need to keep in place. We can continue to review them, and where it makes sense, we can remove them, but we need to maintain those in place while we continue a suppression strategy.
The Premier said earlier this week that she wouldn't be able to advise on the borders until today because you haven't made a decision. What's changed in the last week? Why couldn't this decision have been made a week ago?
Yesterday changed. So I was ready to make that decision, and then I saw that 4 new cases that came from an unknown source, and that changed.
The border won't reopen until before November 3rd at this stage. That's when the decision.
Well, no, the border is opening 1 a.m. on the 3rd of November, except to Victoria and those 32 LGAs in Sydney.
Those 32 LGAs, it can't open to them before November 3rd.
Well, then we'll review the border again at the end of the month, as we do each month. Of course.
Thank you.
Every time we have a change in the borders, it's massive confusion. What does people in New South Wales need to know before November 3rd?
So, very good question, because I was going to tell you all about that. So, look, it's really important that everyone understands that every time we make a decision like this, there is a change to the system. And the community out there, whether they're people wanting to come into Queensland or indeed Queenslanders going into state and returning, need to understand what that means for them. So, just to clarify, as long as we've got any hotspots anywhere in Australia, there will be border controls coming into Queensland. You will require a border declaration pass to get into Queensland. So what will happen is the passes that you may need may well change with these sorts of decisions. So as we've heard, with the move to Greater Sydney being the hotspot, that then changes the dynamics around the bubble, the border pass that we have for those people that live around the Tweed and areas like that across the Queensland-New South Wales border. And it's very, very important that in the lead up to the 3rd of November, 1 a.m, that everyone that has currently got a border declaration pass in play, be it an X-Pass or other passes, check what they should have. It's likely that that will change. And on the 3rd of November, they're going to need the correct pass. So very important that they check the Queensland Government website and the Queensland Health websites and go through the process to update their passes once we get that live in the next few days. Obviously, we've got to do some systems changes to do that. So just a few more things, if I may. It's really important too that people remember that every time we've changed this system, it has caused problems. People don't understand, they get confused, they might apply for the wrong pass, they don't plan ahead for their travel. We know that with particularly the Gold Coast borders that we will see congestion, we'll see delays. That can be mitigated to a great degree if people are prepared for when they travel. So please, for everyone out there, make sure that if you're coming out of a hotspot or you're coming out of an area that's not a hotspot, that you have the correct pass to be able to get into Queensland. And the last thing I'll say before taking any questions you may have is just to remind everyone that this is still under the Chief Health Officer's directions, so we're operating in a lawful environment, and there are penalties for people that do the wrong thing. Absolutely. We've changed our planning all the way through this. We've indeed done planning to keep this going as long as we need to into next year so that we can maintain borders as long as they're required. And similarly, to be able to police the quarantining in the hotels that we're doing at the moment. So we believe we're in a very strong position to maintain that.
What about Sydney siders leave Sydney today?
Sorry.
If any Sydney siders leave Sydney today and want to enter Queensland, what will they need to do to prove that they've been out of Sydney?
So today it's the current regime, so it'll be from the 3rd. It will be the same process that we have. People will be required to provide a declaration as to where they've been. As you've heard from Dr. Young, there are exceptions if they're travelling through those hotspot areas to go to the airport. They need to understand that and what that requires. The system will pick up on whether they've done that correctly and they've declared appropriately. And we will have our police and others at the airport that are assisting us to meet them. And I might add that the ADF is still assisting us with quarantining and those processes. So we will have sufficient resources there to make sure that they've done the right thing.
So there's no other checking process other than a declaration?
It's a border declaration pass. We're obviously looking to improve this, so that system has improved the whole way through, and we're doing more work to improve it into the future.
So how many in Newcastle? They can't go to Sydney for the weekend, go home in the next week, go to Sydney.
The question's very specific. That have you been in a hotspot in the last 14 days? So if you're, and it's the same problem that people have encountered here on the border pass thing, that some have misread or misunderstood and thought that they could go beyond the declared zone. Once they've done that, they've entered a hotspot.
The only reason really to go into Greater Sydney is to get to the airport. Because if you're not going to the airport, you're staying there.
So we're currently working on that direction to get real clarity. So the messaging that will go out through the website and through Queensland Health will be very specific so people understand what the exemptions are, and they need to understand that. So that will be coming online in the next few days.
How many Queensland will be needed to man the border, and how many do you currently?
No, look, we won't be changing our current border posture because it varies depending on what the time of day is. Typically we have a roster of about 1,000 police per roster period. That's right across COVID response. So that's hotel quarantining, That's our follow-up compliance checking. It's also the road borders.
Like over a week period, what's the roster period?
Look, I don't have those exact details, but look, it really makes no difference because we're policing entry via a road that has a certain flow rate. Putting extra police there does not mean it's going to flow any quicker. What it does mean is it slows up the more traffic that we have. So it's a similar sort of overlay no matter what time.
Do you anticipate this will cause more queues, more dramas, more delays for the people who live, reside on the border and just need to...
Look, every time we have changed the border declaration pass system, we have seen delays, and then within 3 days it starts to settle and people get back to normal. So that's why it's so important that people make sure they have the right passes up front and that they can get across the border very seamlessly. And I'm very confident we'll see the same process this time. And I should mention with the airports, of course we're going to see more flights coming into Queensland. We're already in detailed planning with Brisbane Airport Corporation about how we will manage that, and we're very confident that we'll be able to do that as well.
For instance, many people in the city don't know whether they live in the city base. In northwest of Sydney, you can be relatively close to the CBD and actually still be considered outside the CBD.
Yeah, we've been very consistent all the way through this. We have taken a communication, compassion, then compliance approach, so an educative approach. So in that transition period, if people have got it wrong, trying to do the right thing, we'll work with them and make sure that they fix it up. If someone's going to deliberately try to game the system, we'll take the appropriate action.
Are you going to give officers access to iPads or phones? Are you going to have them checking up where a resident?
Our officers have all that equipment at the front line and are meeting the people and they're able to do those checks now. They'll continue to do it. Thank you.
Do you think this decision will improve your chances of being re-elected?
I have said all along to the people of Queensland that I will accept the advice of Dr. Young. Now, Dr. Young has stood Queensland in really good shape. We've had no community transmissions now for a long, long time, and Queenslanders have done the right thing and we have seen no community transmission. So, as I said, I will accept the advice of Dr. Young, and that is exactly what I did today. I kept my commitment. I'm honest with the people of Queensland. That is what I said I would do, and that is exactly what I've done. I've accepted her recommendations to me, lock, stock and barrel.
You committed to the Prime Minister's release. He said he's committed to his plan to reopen by Christmas. Do you accept now that counts for nothing?
No, not at all. We've always said as a National Cabinet we have an aspiration that families can be reunited around Christmas time. But once again, anything can happen. So we need to monitor community transmission. We know Victoria is still in lockdown and they're just slowly coming out of lockdown, and we need to see what happens with those community transmission rates. Dr. Young has said she is concerned about some community transmission in New South Wales. I will always stand up for what is right for the people of this state. I am the Premier of Queensland and I will look after the people of Queensland, and everything I do is to keep them safe. I have said that from day one, and if I am re-elected, that is exactly what I will do. That is up to the people of Queensland to make that decision.
How do businesses function with potentially one case and shut everything back down?
Well, thanks, Jonathan. Let me answer that question. In Victoria, the economy doesn't function when you're in lockdown. When you have a virus that is out of control, your economy is locked down, and that could cost the Queensland economy $3 billion a month. Yes, it is a very clear answer, Jack.
How can businesses have
Thanks, Jack.
with potentially one case, Premier? Can you answer that? Why can't you? Premier, it's a simple question.
I can always answer that. And if, Jonathan, if you can be polite, please. If you can be and respectful and polite, that's all I ask.
I'm asking a question.
No, you are being very...
Whereas if there's one case, you shut the borders and keep people out. And you've got a system now where people can travel from Sydney into regional communities.
Thank you, Jonathan. And let me answer you this. There was 1 or 2 cases in Victoria, right? The virus got out of control and the whole state was locked down, and we saw 700 deaths. I do not want to see 700 deaths in Queensland. I don't want to see our aged care facilities in lockdown. I don't want to see our hospitals where they can't perform surgeries, which is what's happened in Victoria because of a lockdown. I want a Queensland that is strong and a Queensland that is safe. And you can't have a robust economy unless you have a strong health response.
Beyond the decision that was made today, did
Yes.
the Chief Health Officer provide you with any other options?
No, that was the
only
option.
one?
That was the only option the Chief Health Officer provided to me, and I accepted it, lock, stock and barrel.
Will the protocol of doing it at the end of the month stay in place? So
Yes, Joel.
if
Yes,
by
Joel.
the end of next month there is still cases, that shuts us off past Christmas.
Well, like Dr. Young said, we don't have a crystal ball at the moment, so we have to see what happens. And let's be optimistic. Let's be optimistic for Australia. Let's be optimistic and ambitious, and let's hope that everyone does get it under control.
Premier, do you expect to get a thank you call from Gladys Berejiklian about this decision?
Probably not.
Premier, you've talked a lot about your economic recovery plan throughout
Yes.
this campaign. Can you name the 6 priority areas of your economic recovery plan?
Oh, Jack.
And can you explain how those priority areas will assist businesses?
Jack, I have a debate very shortly, but it's about protecting health, it's about growing our regions, it's about making it in Queensland, it's about making sure that we have infrastructure, and it's about skilling Queenslanders for the future.
Sorry to miss the Sydney Airport. Are people from regional New South Wales able to access Sydney Airport?
Yes, they are. Yes, they are. They go straight through. Okay. All right, we'll see everyone at the debate. Sorry?
Mark Kirby from
Yes.
Gold Coast, a point in the paper, didn't quite answer the question yesterday. He talked about a lack of confidence. He's desperate for things to reopen. Do you understand the problems that businesses have, and what are they saying to you about it?
Yes, I do. I do understand, and I know it's tough for business, and it's especially tough for our tourism industry. That is why we have provided so much support for industries in our tourism industry. We have backed them for over $27 million. That's the support that the taxpayers are giving to organisations such as Village Roadshow. I have a debate now, so... Sorry?
How are you spending
Tomorrow
tomorrow morning?
morning, well, of course, it's a very important day for Queenslanders, and it's a day that could actually change their future. I'm asking Queenslanders to back my government. They have a very clear choice of whether or not they want me as Premier or whether they want Deb Frecklington. With this choice, Queenslanders know me. They know me, and what you see is what you get. And you know, at the end of the day, I believe that Queenslanders want stability and they don't want chaos. So yes, I'll definitely be in Anala at some stage, but I'll be out and about, and I'm looking forward to seeing Queenslanders, and to all those Queenslanders that have stopped and said hello along the campaign trail. Thank you very much. Queensland is a wonderful state. I love travelling the length and breadth of our state, and the thing that inspires me the most every single day is the people of this great state. Thank you.
Graham, to
Thank you.
The access to freedom of information.